Hey friends, we have some news from our sponsor Text Control. They just released version 32 of their document processing library, which includes new core functionality such as document footnotes, SVG export, and more. You can integrate document editing, signing, collaboration, and PDF processing into your ASP.NET Core and Angular applications with Text Control. These powerful libraries will let your developer teams focus on their core competencies, while Text Control handles your digital document processing. Check out all the new features and see the technologies live in action by visiting the demo at demos.textcontrol.com. That's demos.textcontrol.com. Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today I'm chatting with Shaun Walker. He's the founder of Oqtane Labs and DevEssence. He, in fact, is the original creator of Oqtane and DotNetNuke. These are web application frameworks that have been around for many, many years and one of the first open source pioneers native to the Microsoft platform. How are you, Shaun?
I am doing well. It's great to be on the show. I've always been an admirer of Hansel Minutes, and so it's good to be here.
Oh, well, flattery will get you anywhere on the show, so I appreciate you opening with that. Thank you so much. And speaking of flattering, DotNetNuke, man, I used DotNetNuke back in the day. When did that come out originally?
It was originally released in late 2002. So that was originally, .NET Framework 1.0. So I think it even started being developed originally on the earlier betas of .NET Framework. So that's more than 20 years ago now. So it's pretty incredible that it's had this kind of longevity. There's very few technologies I can think of that are still widely used after 20 years, notably things like COBOL and Fortran and perhaps things that probably shouldn't mention.
But it's worth pointing out, though, that we joke about COBOL and Fortran, which I think are arguably legacy and old, but .NETNuke and now Oqtane have remained fresh. Is that simply through sheer organizational willpower, or is that the power of community?
I think it's the power of community, especially with .NETNuke. There always was a really strong open source element to it. There was also a commercial element that was created about 5 or 6 years into its journey. And that was an interesting transition to create a large business around open source. But then that sort of ran its course. And then the project ultimately was handed back over to the community and they took over, responsibility for it. And that's where it is today. Oqtane is a more recent open source effort, only about 4 or 5 years old at this point. So it still feels quite fresh to me.
Why is building platforms and CMSs your thing? Is it that you like to see people build stuff on top of your stuff?
It's a good question. I guess even before I got involved in building open source solutions, when I worked internally at companies, I would often build reusable, I guess you could call them controls maybe, or frameworks would be maybe a bit of a stretch, but I like building tools that other developers could use to make their lives easier, right? And also it tended to create consistency within the applications that were built, would make them easier to maintain because, ultimately I'm a bit lazy and I don't want to have to dig through a lot of code that's different every time. I'd rather look at something that feels consistent and familiar, and then I feel like I'm a lot more productive with it.
You said that .NETNuke, that from a business perspective, ran its course. I want to back up and understand how this kind of like the bell curve, the peak and the valleys occurred. You make it in 2001-2. It starts being a thing. It's still a hobby. It's a side thing. Somewhere a couple years into it, you realize that people really like this thing. Then you decide, I need to make a business, a consulting business around it?
Yeah, initially it was a consulting business. Myself and 3 other co-founders actually created a company called DNN Corp. And we basically did some consulting around the platform for a few years. And then we decided that we should get more serious about it. There was a lot of factors involved in that, partly because it was still difficult to sustain the kind of needs of the open source community based on, just the input of 4 full-time people. We needed more resources to do more. And so we decided that we would raise venture capital. So that actually took a couple of years because despite the fact that the project had a lot of adoption, we didn't have a good business model. And we didn't have a repeatable business model where we could point at customers and we could demonstrate, that it was going to be easy to acquire more customers. And so it wasn't until 2008 that we raised our first round of venture capital funding. And then, of course, once that happened, then things change significantly. And we actually were fortunate enough to create a commercial version. I think we ended up getting more than 2,000 customers signed up for it. We had a couple more rounds of venture capital that came into the company. Then things got difficult because the business sort of plateaued. There was a lot of competition, a lot of changes in technology that happened. And by about 2013, 2014, things just got really difficult internally. We were having difficulty raising more funding. And ultimately, I left in 2014.
And during all of this, you're building community, you've got conferences and summits, and people are showing up. It's a whole ecosystem. This is a CMS that people build their businesses on top of. It's kind of WordPress, it's kind of this, it's kind of that, but it's a platform. It's a little more advanced in the sense that people are building their own entirely custom solutions on top of it. Was that a conscious decision to allow people to really extend it in ways that you hadn't even thought about?
Yeah, absolutely. It was always intended to be a platform. It was built right from the beginning with lots of extensibility points so that you could build plugins that would be fully functional applications that would work with framework. So you'd leverage some of the APIs that were provided to you and some of the, even UI functionality that you could utilize that was consistent then across your applications. There was vendors who created third-party extensions, basically as an ISV type of a business. Some of those vendors still exist today, selling exclusively applications for the DotNetNuke platform. And then other people just built internal applications that were custom for their needs.
It's amazing that other whole businesses are sitting on top of your businesses. You know what I mean? Like, that must be stressful.
Well, yeah, it definitely makes it very mission critical once you realize you've got very large enterprise customers that are built on top of your solution. Like at one point we had 4 branches of the military in the United States running their public websites on DNN. So we had some very, very large customers. So that's another reason why I think we at one point decided that we needed to ramp it up and we needed more resources to really, build a substantial solution.
So you start as open source, you build a business, and the next thing you know, giant customers. Is that the correct and sustainable direction for open source?
So that's a good question. And I've talked about this a bunch lately, but it's certainly a path that I am most comfortable with. I tried a lot of different business models. Ultimately, I believe that the only path to success when a project gets great adoption is to build a business around it. The reality is you should be thinking about your open source project as if it were a business from day one, or else you're going to end up becoming what I call a victim of your own success, right? The project's going to quickly outgrow what you thought it was going to achieve, and then you're going to be backed into a corner, and you're going to feel sometimes it feels like there's no way out of that corner. And I think a lot of people who have built open source software, started with a cool idea. They didn't know if other folks were going to be interested in utilizing their solution. They put it out there. All of a sudden, they have a lot of adoption. And they also realize that there's a lot of people that aren't going to pitch in to help. And then things get difficult.
Do you think of open source as being like streaming services? Like right now, I pay $11.99 for Netflix. And I think that people who are out there, there's Netflix, which is this aggregator of amazing content. There's no open source aggregator of amazing libraries. So it's not like Netflix wants my $11.99. It's that an individual show on Netflix wants my $11.99. So instead of me paying GitHub or some aggregator, $10, $12, every individual library author from a mocking framework to a testing framework to a fully featured platform all feels like their thing is worth $12 a month. And then just like cable services, I'm I don't got $300 worth of nickel and diming, $8-10. Is that a reasonable analogy?
I think so. I think what you're referring to though is how many open source projects people are willing to pay money for. And if they ultimately had to pay money for all of the open source solutions that they were utilizing as part of their sort of development stack, it could quickly add up to a lot of money. And I don't know if that's transferring that onto consumers is a great model either. Some of those open source projects clearly maybe add more value than others, but usually it takes more than just code, right? You're going to have to step up and provide support and other types of service around your open source project. if you're going to treat it as something that people are going to pay money for.
Yeah. It seems, though, that there's a lot of, I don't want to say pleading, but there's a lot of people online who are trying to get folks to look within themselves and think about empathetically of the hardworking open source maintainers. So we're basically like, again, I don't know what the word is. It's not pleading, but it's just like, hey, think of the children. And in doing that, that's a guilt-based business model, and guilting people into paying, if everyone had just paid $1, this thing wouldn't go away. But there's always some poor person, like that individual, that fellow who did curl. It's like one guy on the planet who's in charge of curl, or one guy on the planet, or maybe that's OpenSSL. It's like one professor who's just, the entire internet is sitting on this one library and no one cares about that guy.
I think the reality is probably the majority of open source projects are run that way, right? Where there's one or two sort of core maintainers that are responsible for everything, like their vision, and it's ultimately, their responsibility. And so if that maintainer decides to stop supporting their project, or something even worse happens to them, then that project is in deep, deep trouble. I mean, that is a legitimate concern. But I think the point that you made, though, about people trying to maybe create sympathy for open source maintainers, that is a real thing. That's been happening a lot in recent years. And in the messaging around that, it's often portrayed that big enterprise is taking advantage of the little guy, right? They're taking open source projects and they're creating, value-added solutions around them and making money and not contributing anything back. And I think it's pretty easy to point fingers and make larger companies look like the bad guy. But ultimately, I think the maintainers of these projects still are kind of missing the point, right? That's not going to produce a sustainable option for them. They still have to take a step back and try to understand how to create like a legitimate business around their open source project. Because I think a lot of them would love to maybe get some passive revenue, right? In the form of like donations, and maybe enough to even focus full time on their open source project. But that doesn't really seem realistic. I think any of us would love to just do our hobbies and get paid for them, right? And not have to work. That would be great. But I don't know of any industry that really supports that kind of a model.
That is a really interesting point you bring up, because there's this moment where it's like, I do it on the weekends and then it consumes my life. I have a full-time job and then I'm doing open source another 30 or 40 hours a week. The question is, why are you investing that 30 or 40 hours? You want to grow it. And it's at that moment when you're effectively a full-time volunteer, then you start getting resentful. One starts getting resentful and they want some recompense. And then they realize that, wow, I'm making $2 an hour doing what I think is high-value work. And to your very excellent point, and I think this is the quote of the show, sympathy is not a business model.
Yeah, unfortunately, because I've been doing open source a long time. So have you. And I'm sure that we would love to get some compensation for our efforts, but that's not where we started, right? We created these open source projects because we love technology usually, and because we love solving problems. And then often it's because we want to, share our solution with others. It's once it becomes like transitions into becoming a burden on the rest of your life, then you start thinking about, I deserve something more for this.
I wonder if you're describing the uncanny valley of open source, where it's consuming enough of my life that I need to be paid, but not so much that I can actually run a business on the thing. And if you hop across the uncanny valley, which very few people do, then on the other side, there's a viable business.
Yeah, if you can kind of cross that chasm, right, so to speak, it's not easy. It's essentially creating a business, right? And whether it's an open source business or a commercial software business or any kind of business, it's hard. You're going to have challenges, and a lot of businesses fail.
And not everyone that makes a small library that does a thing has business abilities or the patience or the interest in being the CEO or the CTO of a large business, because that's not what they signed up for.
I think that's probably the most challenging form of open source, is when it's a very niche utility. It might be getting a ton of use, but if it only does one sort of very niche, specialized thing, it's very difficult to create a business around that, right? If it's so deep in the stack that people barely even know it's there, even if it's mission critical, it's difficult to monetize.
But it's mission critical, and then everyone uses it, and then it becomes a core part of the expectation, even commoditized because people expect that it exists. Then it kind of is indistinguishable from the platform itself, whether it be left pad or mock, left pad on the Node side, mock on the .NET side, it's valuable and it is the linchpin of the thing. So let me ask you this question: flipping all of this on its head, rather than trying to get, squeeze $5, $7, $10 from the regular people, why doesn't the giant corporation then throw millions at it? And what's the right number there? Like, why doesn't Microsoft give .NetNuke or Oqtane, here's X million dollars? Because how many times can a giant corporation throw X million dollars at a library or a platform?
Yeah, so it's not really a scalable model, right? To keep throwing money at like open source solutions created by maintainers that are essentially doing it in their spare time. I guess going back to the very beginning of .NetNuke, I was very fortunate, like you mentioned, sort of like it was one of the pioneering open source projects. I was super fortunate in, I think it was 2003, so maybe 6 months after .NetNuke was released, I tried to create a bit of a revenue model around it, like a subscription model. And people were very quick to point out that that is not open sourced, right? Like, you've misled us into believing that you want to create a community open source solution here, but now you want to make money from it. That's terrible. Created a lot of noise in the .NET ecosystem. And ultimately, Scott Guthrie reached out to me by email and said, hey, I actually like what you're doing here. I'd like to talk more about how Microsoft could potentially help you out. And so I actually drove down to Redmond, had a meeting with Scott, and that resulted in a sponsorship for .NetNuke for a 1-year period where I could actually focus my efforts full time on developing the open source project with input from the ASP.NET team. So I was super lucky there. And I don't think that that model could be replicated over and over and over again, right? It just wouldn't scale. But it certainly helped .NetNuke grow quickly and get adoption and probably have the right kind of oversight, right? And the right type of input. Like, this is the direction that we're headed with ASP.NET. If you go in this direction, you're going to be in nice alignment, with where we're headed. So that's kind of a tangent.
But when you do those kind of sponsorships, though, that's going to be an amazing year. I think the worst part of that year, though, would be month 12.
Yes, it was. Yep. Because then it was like, oh, this is all coming to an end. This is not like going on indefinitely. Now I better think hard about what my real business model is, right? Because it's not going to be sponsorship from Microsoft.
And then if you got an extra year, or if you started to present resentment and frustration because suddenly now you're coming down off the other end of the curve, maybe you get sponsored for a second year. And now you're 2 years into it. It's going to be really easy to just forget that there's an end to that. Like, you can't always do that. So this brings us to the part of the show where I say, well, hang on, if I can't get millions from the giant company and I can't get a buck or two from the public, where is the viable business? Because there's going to be people listening to this show who are going to say, well, hang on, you're both wrong.
Yeah.
Giant company has billions. They should be able to throw a couple of million your way. And they're going to say, developers are well paid. Their companies should absolutely sponsor for a couple of grand. Like, if you're using an image library, your company should absolutely license that library.
Yeah. There's a lot of different perspectives on this, and everyone's ultimately right and everyone's wrong. It really depends on where you're coming from and what your needs are. Like, in theory, there's lots of good ideas, even the one that you touched on. Like, if a large company was able to create maybe an open source fund of some sort, right, where they could earmark a certain amount of funds they are willing to invest into community solutions every year. Then you have to hire management to oversee the fund, and you have to come up with some kind of a fair system for allocating the fund. And it quickly becomes this beast, right, to manage and deal with. And again, so these simple ideas, the simple solutions are never simple, right, at the end of the day.
Yeah. And if you go to any open source library or project's website and you click on pricing, you get to see how not simple it is, because it's going to be, there's usually, it's too expensive for the hobbyist and not expensive enough for the enterprise or whatever, and some combination. And then you get into dual licensing and per use licensing. Like, we're seeing Unity make just horrible mistakes right now, embarrassing themselves and trying to accommodate people.
Seems like they've tried to appease the community with some of the more recent announcements, and probably learn maybe the hard way that they probably should have talked more to the community before they made the original announcement. But we've all been there. It's a painful lesson to learn.
Indeed. Now, of course, Unity, not open source, but all the open source alternatives like Godot and gdevelop and Default are all trying to figure out, well, like, wait a second, maybe this can be the moment, the inflection point where our project goes to the next level.
On the story that I told you about the Microsoft sponsorship, that was all like super positive. There's probably one detail there that I've never actually told anyone, is that even in that sponsorship agreement, there was, of course, requirements that were added to the agreement by Microsoft to ensure that I was serious about following through on my commitments. And so as part of that agreement, I actually had to sign over the .netnuke.com domain name to Microsoft as part of the terms of that agreement. And so these are like legal contracts, right? And usually there's carrot and stick kind of things in every contract. And so that came up a bit later when we got venture capital funding, because I had to ask Microsoft to basically sign the domain name back to me so that I could actually still retain it, like rights to the brand that I've created. So
how many years ago was that? That sounds like old Microsoft thinking.
So we got funding in 2008. Yeah. So it is a long time ago, 15 years ago.
15 years ago. So it sounds like they were trying to put their finger on the chess piece because they weren't sure the move that they were going to make. And in doing that,
I completely understood, right? I don't think anyone who's in business signs an open-ended contract, not completely open-ended, right? There's always commitments on both sides.
Hey friends, are you dealing with excessive context switching in your daily development tasks? Maybe spending too much time looking for that one code snippet that you lost in the chaos of your development workflow. You're not alone. Even if you do surface that snippet in your Notes app or you find it in Teams, do you remember the context behind it? Check out Pieces for Developers. We use this to manage development materials across your workflows. This is the tool that exists between your tools. Now, it seamlessly integrates with your IDE, with your browser, and with your collaboration tool like Slack or Teams. And it makes it easy to save and search, share and reference, and reuse code snippets throughout your work-in-progress journey. Now, my favorite feature is Pieces Copilot. This sets custom context with your personal code base, and you can ask it who you can contact for a particular issue. And it's completely on device. You can use this Copilot without an internet connection. Super cool. Check it out. Pieces.app/Scott. You can download the desktop application for free and start boosting your developer productivity today. All right, so I wanted to pivot to Oqtane, Oqtane. And I want to say kudos to you because we are about 25 minutes into our podcast here. But if at this moment you go to GitHub, you just merged a pull request into dev like 10 minutes before you got on this show, which I think shows dedication that people would not ordinarily see. Apparently you hit merge and then you jump on a podcast call. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time in the code for Oqtane. I guess people could look at it as almost like a v.next version of .NetNuke. It has a lot of the same concepts built into it, like multi-tenancy and modularity and things like that. But of course, it was all built from the ground up on .NET Core and took advantage of Blazor right from the earliest stages. So it's quite mature at this point because I started developing it in 2018. And, we're now like 5 or 6 years into it, and it's pretty powerful.
And it's on version 4. So when you say mature, this isn't some new thing that you came up with last weekend. You're on version 4. I think 4.03 just came out. And you're all in on C#, which I think is interesting because in a world right now where people are building everything in JavaScript, and whether it's React or Redux or this or that, there's a lot of churn in the JavaScript space. You're writing C# on server and client.
Yeah, I don't know. That was a decision I made early on. And I think that maybe that's based on my own personal preference. I've never been super keen on JavaScript. I've always felt more comfortable with C#. I thought it was a great value proposition that you could use C# on the front end and the back end. And so I bought all into Blazor, and I'm sure that that's in some ways limited the early adoption of Oqtane because it took a while for the general industry to get on board with this idea. And even today, there still is a lot of critics, right, that would say that, if you're going to do front end, you should be using a JavaScript framework because they're just so far advanced to where Blazor's at. I would disagree, but again, these are one of these opinionated areas where you're going to get a lot of different perspectives.
Now, if I go to octane.org, again, it's Oqtane, and I hit view source, it looks very clean. I think about Blazor, I think about WebAssembly, I think about the idea of running C# on the client as being something that's going to be kind of chaotic. So I assume, as any open web person would, when you hit view source, you're going to see chaos. Like when you go to Gmail and you go right-click view source, you're usually disappointed. But this is very clean. It looks almost like someone, wrote it from hand.
Yeah, that is one of the nice things about Blazor is because there sort of is the focus, right, is not on a lot of client-side scripting. That's what you're talking about. When you view source on a JavaScript framework application, right? It's pretty hard to follow. It looks like spaghetti. So yeah, Blazor produces pretty clean markup, which is, I guess is one of the benefits. Because clean markup is easy to parse, and it's fairly, it provides decent performance as well. That's why I named it Oqtane, right? It's the measure of performance in fuel. Although I guess fuel is now considered to be not such a good thing.
Well, you'll have a hybrid Oqtane thing in the future that'll have batteries, and it'll be electric Oqtane or something like that.
That's right.
That'll be fine.
Yeah.
So Oqtane is open source. How are you going to make this different than DotNetNuke? Is there a consulting business behind it? Do I buy copies of Oqtane depending on how I use it?
So right now it's a pure open source project. I have the consulting business DevEssence, and we're doing client projects around Oqtane. I recently launched a marketplace for Oqtane as well. So creating that similar model for ISVs who want to build extensions, they'll be able to, that's always been possible for open source extensions, but I created a commercial marketplace now so that people will be able to sell their extensions in an official marketplace. The next logical step is to actually have a commercial version of Oqtane as well. That is a plan, because there are a lot of companies out there that won't really consider open source solutions without a support model behind them, right? They're really looking for a throat to choke, so to speak, right? Someone that they could ultimately talk to if they run into difficulties. So I see that as a natural kind of extension of an open source solution where the two kind of can live very happily side by side.
When I went to the Oqtane marketplace at Oqtane.net, I immediately saw that category pivot is open source and commercial. That seems very intentional.
Yeah, instead of listing them together, because on the commercial side, there is the ability for people to build commercial solutions that are freemium, right? So they could still have no cost. But I view open source as being a different category unto itself, right? Because open source ultimately has community around it. It is more voluntary in nature, whereas commercial is a completely different element, right? If you're providing a commercial solution, even if it's premium, you are committing to supporting that product.
So what is the right thing? What is the answer for the folks that we've been talking about that have either small, medium, or large size platforms? Do they always just kind of struggle with this metronome as they go back and forth between maybe that's a little too free and maybe that's a little too expensive?
I think that that's going to be a constant struggle just because of the fact that it's not possible really to commercialize every open source project, even ones that are really valuable, right, and provide really critical functionality. There is no silver bullet or perfect solution. And there's a lot of folks that just want to, focus on the tech, right? They have no business aspirations whatsoever. And so those types of people might hope for monetary support in the form of donations and be disappointed at sort of the level that they receive. But ultimately, I don't really have a solution there.
Well, I really appreciate you spending time with us, and we appreciate your hard work in the open source community for now well over 20 years. Thanks so much for hanging out.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. Appreciate it.
We've been chatting with Shaun Walker. He's the original creator of Oqtane and .NET Nuke, and this has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.